Leke, Wori, Afo, Nkwo. May the new day bring life, prosperity, and good health.
They told us Africa was powerless. But the truth? Africa was feared. From the ancient kingdoms along the Nile to the modern struggles of the diaspora, Africa has carried a weight that empires could not ignore. This weight was not weakness, but power. A power so immense that the rest of the world could only respond with suppression, distortion, and fear. The question is, why? Why have Africans from ancient times until now always been treated as a threat? The answer lies not in inferiority, but in strength. Africa's civilizations were never faceless or voiceless. They stood on foundations of profound knowledge, spiritual mastery, and cultural resilience. From the libraries of Timbuktu to the mysteries of Dogon astronomy, Africa held keys to wisdom that unsettled outsiders who came in search of conquest. From the battlefields of Zulu warriors to the revolts of enslaved people in the Americas, African bodies proved unbreakable. From the shrines of Igbo Dibiyas to the temples of Kemet, Africa wielded spiritual power that frightened foreign rulers who could not control it. And from its proverbs, music, and oral traditions flowed cultural systems so durable that even centuries of slavery and colonization could not erase them. This is why Africa was feared. Its people were never passive. They resisted chains. They protected their gods. They carried memory when all else was stolen. And even when stripped of weapons, they fought with songs, with spirit, with the unshakable conviction that they were more than what empires told them they were. To those who sought domination, this was the greatest danger of all. A people who could not be fully conquered. The narrative of Africa as weak was carefully constructed. But behind it lies a history of empires trembling as a thought of African resistance, African unity, and African genius. To call a people powerless while fearing them is not contradiction. It is strategy. A strategy designed to make the world forget what Africa has always known, that its strength is spiritual, cultural, physical, and intellectual. This story is not about victimhood. It is about power. Power that survived slavery. Power that outlasted colonization. Power that continues today in the resurgence of African identity and spirituality. To understand why Africa was feared is to understand that the real untold truth is this: Africa was never weak. Africa was always dangerous. Dangerous to empires because it carried the one thing they could never fully control: the authority of spirit, memory, and resilience. From the very beginning, Africa's greatest weapon was not the spear or the shield, but knowledge. Long before Europe claimed the mantle of enlightenment, Africa had already birthed systems of science, mathematics, and spirituality that shaped the very foundations of human civilization. Egypt, or Kemet as it was known to its people, stood as a testament to this truth. The temples along the Nile were not merely places of worship, but universities of the ancient world. Priests studied the stars, physicians practiced medicine, and mathematicians calculated the measurements that allowed them to build pyramids that still confound modern engineers. Geometry, algebra, and the principles of architecture were not European inventions but African legacies, and they were infused with spirituality so that science and sacredness were never separate. It was this depth of knowledge that drew the Greeks and later the Romans into awe and unease. Writers such as Herodotus and Plato recorded their encounters with African wisdom, often with reverence, but also with caution. They described priests in Egypt as custodians of truths older than time itself, truths that even the philosophers traveled across deserts to learn. Greek students sat at the feet of African teachers, importing concepts of cosmology, ethics, and metaphysics that they later claimed as their own. Yet, along with this reverence came fear. For to admit that Africa was the fountain of wisdom was to undermine the myth of European supremacy. The easiest way to deal with this contradiction was through appropriation on one hand and demonization on the other. Thus, Africa was both a cradle of learning and a source of anxiety. But Kemet was not the only seat of knowledge that unsettled outsiders. Deep in West Africa, the Dogon people of Mali carried astronomical insights that left European scientists baffled centuries later. Long before telescopes, the Dogon described the existence of Sirius B, a companion star to Sirius, invisible to the naked eye. They spoke of its orbit and density with a precision that modern astronomy only confirmed in the 20th century. How could a people without modern instruments know what only advanced science would later discover? Outsiders who encountered this knowledge could only interpret it in two ways. Either Africa was blessed with divine insight, or it was a land of sorcery and danger. Either way, the Dogon's mastery of the cosmos made Africa a place to be feared. The Yoruba system of Ifa divination is another example of knowledge as power. Ifa is not simply a method of fortune-telling, but a vast repository of spiritual and philosophical wisdom encoded in its 256 odus. Each odu contains stories, parables, and teachings that guide not only individuals but entire communities. For the Yoruba, Ifa was a way of aligning human life with cosmic orders. To outsiders, however, it was unnerving. A system too complex to dismiss, too accurate to ignore, and too sacred to control. European colonizers saw in Ifa a rival system of authority, one that granted Africans autonomy and resilience in the face of oppression. Similarly, the Congo cosmogram embodied a worldview that challenged outsiders. This sacred symbol represented the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, mapping the journey of the soul across visible and invisible realms. It was a philosophy of continuity, where ancestors remained ever present and guiding. To colonial officials and missionaries, this idea was dangerous. If people believed their dead still walked with them, they could not be fully conquered. If they trusted in cycles beyond death, they could not be broken by threats of annihilation. What tied all these systems together was their ability to empower African societies with a sense of cosmic order and spiritual authority. Knowledge was not hoarded by elites alone, but shared through ritual, proverb, and oral tradition. It made Africa a continent not of ignorance but of profound insight. And to outsiders, this was terrifying. To face a people whose pyramids touched the sky, whose priests charted the stars, whose diviners spoke with the voice of destiny, and whose cosmograms declared that death itself could not end their story. This was to face a civilization that could not be easily subdued. Thus, from Kemet to the Dogon, from the Yoruba to the Congo, Africa's wisdom was both revered and feared. Revered because it illuminated paths others could not find, and feared because it reminded the world that Africa was never a blank canvas waiting for discovery, but a library of power that empires could only hope to borrow from or attempt to destroy. The strength of Africa was never only in its wisdom but also in its flesh and spirit. Across the continent and the diaspora, African warriors proved again and again that they could not be broken, that their very existence posed a threat to those who sought to dominate them. This threat was not imagined. It was lived embodied in countless battles where Africans resisted conquest with resilience, strategy, and courage that shocked even the most heavily armed empires. Far from being passive victims of history, Africans were always seen as dangerous precisely because they fought back, and often fought with a spirit that seemed unshakable. Among the Zulu of Southern Africa, this truth was undeniable. Under the leadership of King Shaka and the early 19th century, the Zulu transformed into one of the most formidable military forces on the continent. Shaka revolutionized warfare with the new tactics, introducing the short stabbing spear known as the Iklua and tight regimental formations that overwhelmed enemies. The Zulu did not simply defend their territory, they expanded it, pushing back against colonial encroachment with unmatched ferocity. For European settlers, the very name Zulu became synonymous with terror, for here was a people who fought not only with skill, but with an intensity that revealed their deep connection to land and spirit. In West Africa, the Dahomey Amazons, an all-female military regiment, shattered stereotypes of weakness. Trained from a young age in discipline, combat, and loyalty, these women became the elite protectors of the Dahomey Kingdom in present-day Benin. Their ruthlessness in battle astonished French soldiers who described them as fearless and unyielding. To European powers, the existence of such a force, women who fought with more ferocity than most men, was incomprehensible and therefore terrifying. They were not merely anomalies, they were living proof that African societies contained reservoirs of power that Europe could neither predict nor control. In the Sudan, the Mahadist warriors rose in the late 19th century to resist Anglo-Egyptian rule. Driven by a fusion of faith and military determination, they inflicted humiliating defeats on the British, most famously at the Battle of Khartoum. Armed with little more than spears and rifles scavenged from previous battles, they overwhelmed imperial armies that had assumed their superiority was unassailable. For a time, the Mahadist movement carved out a sovereign state, proving that African resistance could not only challenge but also overturn the colonial order. The physical threat of African resilience extended beyond the continent. In the Americas, enslaved Africans carried with them the same spirit of defiance. No story demonstrates this more powerfully than the Haitian Revolution. Beginning in 1791, enslaved men and women, inspired by both African spirituality and the dream of freedom, rose against their French oppressors. Against overwhelming odds, they defeated Napoleon's forces, the most powerful army in the world at the time, and declared Haiti the first Black Republic in 1804. This was no ordinary revolt. It was a seismic shock to the global order. Enslavers everywhere trembled, knowing that if Africans could overthrow their masters in Haiti, the same could happen in Jamaica, Brazil, or the American South. Haiti became proof that Africans were never passive cargo, but always a threat, even when chained. These fears of African resistance explains why enslavers and colonizers developed brutal systems of control. They did not see Africans as docile. They saw them as dangerous. They feared a rebellion on plantations, uprisings in colonies, and revolts in the very heart of empire. Every law that stripped Africans of rights, every shackle that bound their wrists, every whip that scarred their backs was an admission of fear. Fear of what might happen if their spirit of resistance was left unchecked. The truth is that Africans were never perceived as weak. They were feared because they refused to accept subjugation as natural. They fought with weapons when they had them, with fire and fists when they did not, and always with the spirit that would not yield. To face such a people was to face not only warriors of flesh, but the warriors of spirit. And this is why empires trembled. Africa was not a continent of submission. It was a continent of resistance. And that resistance made it dangerous to all who sought to rule it. Perhaps the most enduring threat Africa posed to outsiders was not its armies or its rebellions, but its spiritual power. For while political kingdoms could be toppled and warriors slain, Africa's spiritual systems were far harder to destroy. They lived in the soil, in the rivers, in the songs, in the bodies of priests, mediums, and ordinary people who carried ancestral knowledge in their daily lives. These were weapons unseen, charms that protected, rituals that resisted, and ancestral laws that bound communities together, even when empires tried to tear them apart. To colonizers and missionaries, such powers were not only incomprehensible, but terrifying. Among the Igbo of Nigeria, the principles of Ofo and Ogu embodied this invisible authority. Ofo, represented by a sacred staff, symbolized justice, truth, and the ancestors' presence in human affairs. To invoke Ofo was to call on the highest spiritual law, one that no king or colonial official could override. Ogu represented innocence and righteousness, a declaration that one stood blameless before the divine. Together, Ofo and Ogu formed a moral shield that no empire could easily penetrate. Even when stripped of political autonomy, Igbo communities could rally around these principles, knowing that truth was not defined by the colonizers' courts but by ancestral law. For the British, who depended on imposing their own judicial system, this was dangerous. A people loyal to Ofo and Ogu could not be fully absorbed into colonial order. The Yoruba of West Africa carried a similar power in the vast system of Ifa. Far more than a method of divination, Ifa was a library of sacred knowledge, a guide to aligning human life with cosmic order. Through the verses of the 256 Odus, priests known as Babalawo could diagnose misfortune, reveal hidden causes, and prescribe remedies that restored balance. To the Yoruba, Ifa was a spiritual operating system. To colonizers, it was a rival source of authority. Ifa could predict failure for colonial ventures, empower resistance through ritual, and sustain morale by reaffirming destiny even in times of oppression. This is why colonial administrations and missionaries worked tirelessly to demonize Ifa, branding it superstition and outlawing its rituals. But repression only confirmed its power. Why fear what is powerless? The Fon people of Benin carried their own spiritual arsenal in Vodun, a system that later traveled with enslaved Africans to the Americas. Vodun was a religion of spirits, ancestors, and divine forces woven into every aspect of life. Through possession, ritual, and sacrifice, Vodun empowered communities with strength beyond the material. To colonial powers and Catholic missionaries, this was intolerable. Shrines were burned, rituals outlawed, and priests persecuted. The church declared Vodun demonic, a deliberate strategy to sever Africans from the powers that gave them resilience. But suppression did not destroy Vodun. Instead, it transformed. It survived underground in Africa and re-emerged in the diaspora as Vodou in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, and Santeria in Cuba. Far from being extinguished, Vodun became the very foundation of slave revolts, culminating in the Haitian Revolution, where spiritual ceremony ignited political resistance. The British themselves revealed their fear when they banned shrines and sacred gatherings in territories they controlled. They understood that African spiritual systems were more than religious rituals. They were centers of resistance, communications, and solidarity. To destroy shrines was to attempt to sever Africans from their invisible weapons. Yet the people adapted, hiding shrines in forests, disguising rituals as Christian practices, and embedding ancestral symbols in everyday life. This is the essence of Africa's spiritual threat: resilience. Charms, rituals, and ancestral powers gave Africans an unbreakable backbone. Even when chains bound their bodies, they carried amulets beneath their clothes. Even when languages were forbidden, they encoded prayers in songs and drums. Even when shrines were toppled, they built new ones in secret groves or carried them across oceans in memory. Empires could conquer land, but they could never fully conquer spirit. This is why Africa was feared, because its true power did not depend on armies or wealth, but on a spiritual arsenal that empires could not see, could not understand, and could never destroy. Africa's greatest rebellion was not always on the battlefield. It was in the invisible realm where ancestors whispered, oracles spoke, and rituals sustained the people determined to endure. Perhaps the most underestimated source of African power, and the one that terrified oppressors as much as armies or rituals, was culture itself. While empires tried to strip Africans of their land and bodies, they found it far harder to strip away the invisible threads of identity. Culture, in the form of languages, music, proverbs, and oral traditions, became both shield and sword, a living archive of history and a tool of resistance. Colonizers and enslavers soon realized that African culture was not passive expression, but active defiance. It carried memory when memory was forbidden. It spoke freedom when freedom was denied. It reminded every African that they were more than what the world tried to make them. Language was at the heart of this cultural threat. Across Africa, languages were more than communication. They were repositories of philosophy, cosmology, and worldview. Proverbs, for example, distilled complex truths into short, sharp wisdom. An Igbo saying such as, "Until the lion tells his story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter," carried within it not only a moral but a political warning. Beware of one-sided histories. Oral traditions preserved genealogies, myths, and histories stretching back centuries, keeping communities connected to ancestors and cosmologies even when written records were absent or destroyed. Colonizers understood that to silence a language was to weaken identity, and so they imposed European tongues in schools and administration. Yet in villages, markets, and homes, African languages survived, passed down like heirlooms of resistance. Music carried this defiance even further. The drum, in particular, became one of the most feared instruments in the hands of enslaved Africans. To European eyes, it was only percussion. To Africans, it was a voice. Drums spoke in coded rhythms, transmitting messages across distances, calling communities together, and affirming unity when separation was imposed. On plantations in the Americas, enslavers quickly recognized the danger. Drums were banned because they carried too much power. They could incite rebellion, coordinate uprisings, and perhaps most threateningly, keep alive the memory of Africa. Yet Africans adapted. They clapped hands, stomped feet, and transformed every object into a drum, ensuring that rhythm on the heartbeat of identity never died. Names were another powerful tool of cultural survival. In African traditions, names are not random but declarations of destiny, affirmations of identity, and links to ancestors. Enslavers tried to erase this by renaming Africans, branding them with European names meant to sever them from lineage. But names survived in whispers, in secret baptisms, in the persistence of meanings embedded in new tongues. An African child named Chiwetalu, God Still Lives, carried with them a coded reminder of divine resilience. Even when forced to answer to foreign names, many preserved their true names in family memory, passing them down as acts of quiet resistance. Orature, the art of oral literature through story, songs, chants, and proverbs, functioned as both shield and sword. It was shield because it preserved history when colonizers erased records, keeping memory alive in the living word. It was sword because it weaponized creativity against oppression, transforming suffering into coded messages of hope. Spirituals sung in the fields of America carried double meanings, religious on the surface but revolutionary beneath. A song about crossing the Jordan was, to the enslaved, also a map to escape. Colonizers couldn't silence orature because it adapted too quickly, shifting form whenever pressure came. This is why African culture was seen as a threat. It could not be killed with whips, censored by laws, or silenced by prisons. It survived underground, hidden in song, carved into proverb, whispered in language, stamped into rhythm. And in surviving, it kept Africans connected to their ancestors, their gods, and their humanity. Empires feared this because they knew a people who remember who they are cannot be fully enslaved. You can chain a body but not a drumbeat. You can ban a language but not silence a proverb. You can rename a person but not erase the ancestral power carried in their true name. African culture was and remains a threat because it is an identity that cannot be erased. A living archive of freedom that has outlasted empires. One of the greatest threats Africa ever posed to empire was not simply its warriors or its culture, but its minds. African intellectual power has always been formidable, shaping not only the continent, but the entire world. Philosophers, inventors, scholars, and revolutionaries emerged from Africa's soil and diaspora, their brilliance a direct challenge to the myth of African inferiority. Imhotep of ancient Kemet, often hailed as the first recorded polymath in human history, was an architect, physician, and sage whose designs produced the step pyramid and whose medical texts predated Hippocrates by centuries. He demonstrated that scientific genius was African long before Europe's so-called Enlightenment. His legacy was proof that Africa was not the periphery of human knowledge, but its cradle. Centuries later, scholars like Ibn Battuta, though Moroccan by birth, chronicled African civilizations with a respect and detail that unsettled European imaginations. His writings revealed thriving empires in Mali and beyond, filled with wealth, culture, and learning that rivaled anything in Europe at the time. Ahmed Baba of Timbuktu, another towering intellect, left behind the works of law and theology that cemented Timbuktu's reputation as one of the world's greatest centers of knowledge. The libraries of Timbuktu held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and governance, undermining the lie that Africa was a land without history or thought. Europeans who encountered this intellectual tradition were forced to reckon with the truths. Africa's minds could match and often surpass their own. This intellectual power did not end in antiquity. In the modern era, revolutionaries like Marcus Garvey harnessed philosophy and rhetoric to awaken a global consciousness of black pride and unity. Garvey's Pan-African vision terrified colonial powers because it offered not just resistance, but an alternative worldview. One in which Africans and their descendants were not victims, but leaders of a new global order. Similarly, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, educated both in Africa and abroad, fused Western political theory with African communal values to articulate a vision of independence that sparked a wave of liberation across the continent. To empire, these thinkers were not simply political opponents. They were intellectual threats, men whose ideas could rally millions. Colonial systems understood this danger, which is why they targeted education so aggressively. Access to learning was restricted. Schools were designed to produce clerks rather than leaders. And African history was deliberately erased from curricula. Missionary schools emphasized obedience over critical thought, teaching Africans to memorize rather than question. Universities were few and tightly controlled, for colonial authorities knew that educated Africans would demand not only equality, but sovereignty. To deny education was to try to deny memory, to keep Africans from remembering that their ancestors had built pyramids, charted the stars, and written books while Europe was still in darkness. Yet suppression could not erase brilliance. Across the continent and diaspora, Africans found ways to learn, teach, and preserve knowledge outside colonial structures. Secret schools, oral traditions, and underground intellectual networks kept memory alive. Every act of study, every manuscript hidden, every proverb taught to a child was an act of rebellion. Because empire's greatest fear was not just armed resistance, it was a people who remembered their greatness and demanded its restoration. This is why Africa's intellectual power was feared. Knowledge gives shape to destiny. A people who know their past can imagine their future. To remember Imhotep is to remember that African genius built civilizations. To recall Ahmed Baba is to remember that Africa housed libraries that dwarfed Europe's. To invoke Garvey and Nkrumah is to remember that Africa is not simply a continent of suffering, but of visionaries who dared to dream beyond chains. Colonialism thrived on amnesia, but Africa's intellectuals fought to awaken memory. And in memory lies the greatest threat of all, the refusal to accept anything less than dignity, freedom, and power. If there was one force that kept empires awake at night in the 20th century, it was the political awakening of Africa. For centuries, colonial powers relied on the illusion that Africans were divided, voiceless, and incapable of organizing beyond their local tribes and regions. But as the 20th century unfolded, a wave of solidarity rose across the continent and the diaspora, shattering this illusion. Pan-Africanism became more than an idea. It became a political threat, a call for unity that reverberated from Accra to Harlem, from Algiers to Kingston. European dominance depended on Africa remaining fragmented, but Pan-Africanism offered a vision of Africans across the globe standing together, reclaiming power and shaping their own destinies. That vision was terrifying to those who ruled over them. Pan-Africanism was not born in Africa alone. It took root in the diaspora, nurtured by thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who reminded Black people worldwide that their struggles were interconnected. Garvey's cry of Africa for the Africans at home and abroad captured the imagination of millions, unsettling colonial powers who feared that a united Black consciousness could spark global resistance. When African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana embraced Pan-Africanism, the idea moved from theory into statecraft. Ghana's independence in 1957 was not just a national victory, it was a signal to all colonized peoples that freedom was possible. For European empires, this was the beginning of the end. Nkrumah's vision extended beyond Ghana. He dreamed of a United States of Africa, a continental federation strong enough to stand against imperialism. He hosted conferences that brought together leaders from across the continent, encouraging them to see their liberation struggles as one. His efforts inspired movements in Guinea, where Ahmed Sékou Touré declared that his people would prefer poverty in freedom than riches in slavery, and in Algeria, where the National Liberation Front waged a brutal but victorious war against French colonialism. In Angola, the MPLA carried the torch of resistance, supported by a wider network of liberation movements. Every new independence was a dagger in the heart of empire, and yet every independence also carried the threat of spreading further rebellion. This was why European powers, and later their Cold War allies, could not sleep. They recognized that Africa was not just a geographic region, but a battlefield of ideas. If Africa could liberate itself, it would inspire oppressed peoples everywhere. The Cold War only intensified this paranoia. The United States and the Soviet Union both understood Africa's strategic importance, and each feared losing influence on the continent. To Washington, Pan-Africanism and socialism were inseparable threats. To Moscow, the persistence of colonialism was an affront to its ideological battle against Western imperialism. Africa was caught in the middle, but African leaders used this global tension to their advantage, securing support for their independence struggles while navigating the dangers of superpower intervention. For Europe, however, the danger was clear. Independence meant the loss of resources, markets, and prestige. But more than that, independence meant the dismantling of a centuries-old narrative, the myth of African incapacity. Each African flag raised in victory tore apart the justification for colonial rule. Empires that had once seemed eternal now looked fragile, trembling before the power of people they had tried to silence. The political threat of Africa was not just its liberation movements, but the memory of what liberation signified. A free Africa meant the possibility of a united Africa, and a united Africa meant an end to European dominance. This was the nightmare that haunted empires. They could topple governments, assassinate leaders, and meddle in economies, but the spirit of political awakening could not be extinguished. Every attempt to suppress it only confirmed its power. This is why Africa was always seen as a threat. Because the political awakening of its people proved that no empire could last forever. It proved that even the mightiest colonial power could be humbled by the will of a people determined to be free. And it proved, above all, that Africa's story was not one of defeat, but of resurgence. A resurgence that continues to unsettle the world today. Africa was never feared because it was weak. Africa was feared because it was powerful. From the ancient temples of Kemet to the battlefields of Haiti, from the shrines of Ifa to the speeches of Pan-African leaders, Africa's story has always been one of resilience, brilliance, and resistance. The narrative of weakness was manufactured, but beneath it lay the undeniable truth. Africans carried knowledge, strength, and spiritual authority that threatened the foundations of empires. What kings and colonizers truly feared was not submission, but defiance, not silence, but memory, not despair, but hope. Africa's power was the one thing they could not conquer. To reframe this history is to see the continent and its people for what they truly are. Not victims, but visionaries. Not conquered, but continually reborn. The fear that followed Africans across the centuries was proof of their potency. Every ban on drums, every burning of shrines, every classroom stripped of African languages was an attempt to dull a light too bright to extinguish. And yet, here we are, still speaking, still remembering, still rising. The world called Africa dangerous, but in that danger lies dignity. Thrones fall, empires crumble, but the spirit of Africa cannot be destroyed. The pyramids still stand, the songs still echo, the names still carry meaning. The ancestors still walk with us. No matter how many chains were forged, no matter how many borders were drawn, the essence of Africa endures. And today, more than ever, that essence is rising again. As people across the world reclaim traditions, reawaken ancestral wisdom, and tell the stories that were buried for too long. So let this not only be a history lesson, but a call to action. If this story resonated with you, if it awakened something in your spirit, do not keep it to yourself. Like this video, leave a comment sharing your reflections, and subscribe so you never miss another story that reclaims what was stolen. Share this with others so that together we can rewrite the narrative, not as outsiders once told it, but as the ancestors lived it. To everyone watching, thank you. You are part of this ongoing story of resistance and remembrance. By listening, by remembering, by speaking, you keep the flame alive. And as long as that flame burns, Africa will never be forgotten, and its power will never die.